They laughed when a 19-year-old black man walked into the courtroom alone. They mocked his clothes, his silence, his courage. But when he opened his mouth, the entire system held its breath. This isn't just a courtroom story. It's the beginning of a revolution led by someone they never saw coming. Stay to the end. You won't just witness justice. You'll feel it. The River Point County courtroom was unusually still that morning. The quiet hum of murmurs died down the moment a young black man walked in clutching a worn stack of papers. His name was Kendrick Miles, 19 years old, alone. No lawyer, no one by his side. His wrinkled white shirt hung loose on his frame, and his old sneakers squeaked softly against the tiled floor, drawing more attention than the polished shoes of the lawyers in the room. All eyes turned to him, skeptical, dismissive, already judging. At the front, presiding over the courtroom, sat Judge Evelyn Hartley, known for her icy demeanor and little patience for what she called nonsense. Her gaze swept over Kendrick like he was a clerical error in an otherwise orderly system. "You're here without legal counsel," she asked, her voice cold and razor-sharp. Kendrick took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't just a hearing. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance to prove not only his innocence, but his worth in a world that had long underestimated him. "Yes, Your Honor," Kendrick replied, his voice low but steady. "I'll be representing myself." A few scoffs echoed from the back of the room where well-dressed men in expensive suits leaned back watching him like spectators at a comedy show. Judge Hartley raised an eyebrow. "Representing yourself in a reckless driving case. A 19-year-old without a law degree thinks he can challenge the justice system." Her chuckle cut through the silence like a blade. But Kendrick didn't flinch. He quietly opened his folder and pulled out a hand-drawn diagram. "I've studied the Virginia State Traffic Code," he said, voice calm but firm, "and I believe I have sufficient grounds to contest the evidence." Judge Hartley paused. No one expected someone dressed like he'd just clocked out of a convenience store to use the phrase, "contest the evidence." "Well then proceed, Mr. Miles," she said almost mockingly. "Let's see if you can hold our attention for more than 3 minutes." Kendrick stepped forward, holding his diagram and a printed Google Maps image. "On March 14th at 5:45 p.m., I was stopped at the intersection of Oak and Jefferson. The officer claimed I was speeding. However, the radar was positioned at a location with obstructed line of sight, blocked by a lamppost and a large tree." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. Kendrick continued, "According to Section 17.3 of the Virginia State Traffic Code, all speed measuring devices must be calibrated within 30 days prior to use. I requested the calibration report, and to this day I've received nothing." Judge Hartley put her pen down. For the first time, she looked at him not with disdain, but with curiosity. The prosecutor beside her frowned and began whispering to his aide. Kendrick met the judge's eyes. "I'm not here to waste the court's time, Your Honor. I'm here because I believe justice belongs to all of us, even those who can't afford an expensive defense." A heavy silence settled over the room. Judge Hartley leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Kendrick. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked. "I taught myself, Your Honor," Kendrick replied without hesitation. "Since I was 13. I studied every night after work. I wanted to understand why people get treated differently just because they're poor or because they're not white." No one laughed anymore. Even the opposing counsel looked at Kendrick with a newfound seriousness. A soft cough echoed from the back, followed by a long sigh. Something in the courtroom had shifted. Kendrick was no longer just the kid defending himself. He was now the only one in the room who truly understood the law and the stakes. "Please continue, Mr. Miles," Judge Hartley said, her voice quieter, less clipped. "Let's take a closer look at your diagram." Kendrick nodded and began explaining the angles, the officer's position, and the measurement errors. The spectators leaned forward not to ridicule, but to listen. "As you can see, Your Honor," Kendrick said, pointing to his diagram, "the radar was positioned in such a way that the signal would have reflected off the glass facade of the building across the street. That makes the speed reading unreliable. I've also included a physics-based light reflection simulation from a public tool." Judge Hartley flipped through the pages slowly. Her expression changed, still stern, but now tinged with something else, respect. The prosecutor stood up. "Objection. He's not an expert witness," Kendrick replied calmly. "I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm presenting facts, and if necessary, I'm willing to have them verified by an independent third party." People in the gallery began to nod. A man whispered, "He's not bluffing." And Kendrick? He just turned to the judge and said, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be treated fairly like every other citizen under the law. Judge Hartley slowly placed the documents down, resting her hand against her temple, as if weighing something deeper than legal merit. Then she turned toward the prosecutor. Do you have proof that the radar gun was calibrated within the legally required 30-day window? The prosecutor froze. We don't have the document at this moment, Your Honor, but we can obtain it after the hearing. This is unacceptable, she murmured, her eyes drifting back to Kendrick. A teenager with no formal education has prepared a more thorough case than the Commonwealth. Kendrick said nothing. He stood silently, fingers resting lightly on his homemade diagram, eyes steady. From the back of the room, a single clap broke through the tension, sharp, deliberate. Order in the court. Judge Hartley snapped, slamming her gavel. But for a split second, the flicker in her expression betrayed something she hadn't shown in years, a shift. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't in control of the courtroom narrative. A boy in secondhand sneakers and a wrinkled shirt had just reminded everyone what justice was supposed to look like. And she wasn't sure how to feel about it. Kendrick pressed on, his voice gaining strength with every word. He recounted the legal precedents, cited case law with the finesse of someone far beyond his years, and deconstructed the prosecution's timeline with unnerving accuracy. Every point landed with quiet authority. He even referenced a 2019 case so obscure only seasoned attorneys would recognize it. Judge Hartley didn't interrupt. She watched him with folded arms, her gaze sharp yet focused, not dismissive, but absorbing. Have you ever taken any formal law courses? She asked when he paused. No, Your Honor, Kendrick answered. I couldn't afford college, but I studied at the public library every night after my shifts. A hush fell over the room. The opposing attorney lowered his pen. The scoffing spectators from earlier now looked visibly uncomfortable. In that moment, Kendrick wasn't just a defendant. He was the embodiment of perseverance, living proof that brilliance and resilience don't wear a uniform. And for Judge Hartley, that truth hit her harder than any legal argument. What she had once viewed as arrogance was actually determination. What she had once dismissed now demanded her respect. But the prosecutor, red-faced and wounded, wasn't ready to concede. I move for a continuance, he barked. The defendant has clearly received unauthorized assistance. There's no way he could have done this alone. Kendrick's eyes flashed with restrained fury. Are you accusing me of cheating? I'm saying no ordinary teenager could pull this off. Judge Hartley stood, gavel in hand. Counselor Williams, that's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence? The courtroom went silent. Kendrick remained calm on the outside, but inside his heart was pounding. Never in his life had someone in power defended him in public. It was disorienting, like a part of him long buried was being given air for the first time. This is not only inappropriate, the judge continued, it's borderline contempt. Williams sat down, rattled. Kendrick didn't gloat. He simply looked down at his papers and breathed slowly. Because for once, the system wasn't against him. For once, someone at the top of the hierarchy had looked at him and seen more than his skin, his age, or his shoes. They had seen the truth, and it was beautiful and terrifying. During the recess, Kendrick stepped outside the courtroom and sat on a bench in the nearly empty hallway. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. He wasn't afraid, but he was overwhelmed, not by the law, not by the case, but by something far more personal, the weight of finally being seen. He remembered sitting in that same hallway years ago, except back then it was outside the principal's office after being suspended for talking back. He hadn't argued. He had only asked why. Back then his voice had cost him. Today it was changing everything. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned to see Judge Hartley, approaching, heels clicking softly on the tile. You remind me of myself at 25, she said, stopping beside him. Kendrick looked at her, startled. When I was just starting out, I was laughed at too, she continued. Because I was a woman, because I wasn't from the right school. He didn't know how to respond, but I fought back. And so did you. She turned, walked away, and left him with one truth he'd never expected: respect could be earned even in a courtroom where no one expected you to belong. As the court reconvened, Kendrick stood before the judge once more. His closing statement wasn't loud or theatrical. It was measured, heartfelt, and full of truth. Just as he began isn't just a word etched above this bench. It's not about who has the fanciest lawyer or who's dressed the part. It's about truth, about fairness. He laid out emails, maps, photographs, radar placement errors, his case piece by piece. And with each item, the tension in the courtroom thickened. Even the prosecution fell quiet. Judge Hartley leaned forward, chin resting on her clasped hands. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When Kendrick finished, he stepped back slowly. He wasn't sure if he'd won, but he knew he hadn't failed. He had stood up, spoken clearly, and most importantly, forced a room full of people, lawyers, jurors, spectators, to listen to someone they had once dismissed. Judge Hartley gave a small nod and struck her gavel. The court will render its verdict by day's end. Kendrick returned to his seat. Win or lose, he had done what he came here to do. He had made them listen. And in that alone, he had already claimed a kind of victory. After the trial, Kendrick didn't go home. Instead, he crossed the street to a small park across from the courthouse. He sat on a weathered bench beneath a maple tree, still gripping his worn briefcase. The city buzzed around him, but inside he was silent. Not afraid, not relieved, just still. He remembered being 11, sitting next to his mother at the public library. She had worked the night shift at the hospital and still came to read with him. One night she placed a tattered copy of the Constitution in his lap and said, "You may never be rich, Kendrick, but if you know your rights, no one can take your dignity now." As the late afternoon light filtered through golden leaves, Kendrick clutched that memory like a compass. He wasn't sure what the judge's final ruling would be, but whatever came next, he had already shifted something bigger than a verdict. That night he didn't celebrate. He went home, made a simple dinner, and sat in silence. Then he opened his laptop, pulled out a blank document, and typed at the top, "Request for public disclosure of radar calibration records." It wasn't over. He had just begun. The next morning, Kendrick woke to a surprise. A new email sat at the top of his inbox. Subject: "You did good, the sender EH." He blinked. Just two initials, but he knew exactly who it was. Judge Evelyn Hartley. It wasn't formal. It wasn't performative. It was human. But before he could even respond, his phone rang. It was the courthouse. "The judge would like to see you again. This afternoon." His heart raced. Had something gone wrong? When he arrived, he saw reporters outside the building, cameras, microphones, lenses, all aimed at the courthouse steps. "You're the self-represented kid, right?" one of them called out. "The one who tore the case apart." Kendrick just nodded and kept walking. Inside, the clerk handed him a folder. "The judge wants you to review this before going in." Inside were sworn statements from the officer who issued the ticket and an audio file. Kendrick pressed play. I don't know if he was speeding. He was just some black kid in a beat-up car. Figured he wouldn't fight it. Kendrick's breath caught. The truth had arrived uninvited, undeniable, and unforgiving. As Kendrick entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Judge Hartley sat upright, her expression unreadable. "I received this recording from the police department early this morning." She began her pause sharper than before. She reached over and pressed a button. The officer's voice filled the courtroom. He looked like trouble. Didn't clock him right. Just wrote him up. Who's he gonna call a lawyer? A stunned silence swept through the room. Even the prosecutor lowered his head. Judge Hartley turned to Kendrick. "Would you like to respond?" He looked around the courtroom at the rows of seats that once held smirks and scoffs. Now they held shame and awe. "No, Your Honor," he said softly. "The recording speaks for itself." From the back, a woman began to weep. Someone else whispered, "This is what happens every day. We just don't hear it." Hartley leaned back in her chair, visibly shaken. "I will issue my ruling at 3 p.m. As she exited the bench, Kendrick remained still. Not because he was stunned, but because a truth he'd carried alone for years had finally echoed through walls meant to silence it. And this time, the system had to listen. At 3 p.m. sharp, the courtroom overflowed. Word had spread. This was no longer just a traffic hearing. It had become a mirror for a broken system. Reporters jostled for space. Spectators leaned forward in anticipation. And Kendrick, seated quietly in the front row, felt the weight of every eye. Judge Hartley entered carrying the final verdict like something fragile yet heavy. After thorough review, she began, "This court finds the defendant, Kendrick Miles, not guilty." The gavel struck, but it wasn't just a declaration. It was an eruption, a standing ovation, applause, tears. Kendrick sat frozen. For a moment, the noise blurred into a dull hum. His heart was too full to process sound. Judge Hartley stood, and instead of walking out, she started to be down from the bench and approached Kendrick. "You didn't just win a case today," she said. "You challenged us. You reminded this court what justice looks like when it's alive." She extended her hand. Kendrick rose and shook it, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more than you know." And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't a place of punishment. It was a place of possibility. As Kendrick stepped out of the courthouse, a wave of cameras and voices surged toward him. "Do you have a message for young people watching this?" one reporter asked. Kendrick paused. He looked directly into the lens, eyes steady. "I'm not here to be famous," he said. "I'm here to be heard, and to make sure others are too." Flashbulbs popped. Microphones surged closer, but Kendrick had already turned away. He pulled a faded photo from his wallet, one of him as a child sitting on his mother's lap in front of the library where she first taught him to read. He whispered, "We did it, Mom." From the courthouse entrance, Judge Hartley watched silently. She saw him walk away, not triumphant, not boastful, but changed. The boy in the scuffed sneakers had become something else. A symbol, not just of victory, but of truth spoken fearlessly, of laws made human again. And she smiled, a quiet curve of her lips that said more than any ruling ever could. A new era had begun, and it started not with a lawyer, not with a judge, but with a boy who believed that knowing the law was the first step to rewriting it. That evening, Kendrick sat alone on the rooftop of his apartment building. The city lights blinked in the distance like quiet witnesses to everything he had endured. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt reflective. For the first time in his life, people weren't dismissing him, they were listening. But with that came a different kind of weight. His phone buzzed. A breaking news alert: 19-year-old stuns Virginia courtroom with self-defense legal victory. Kendrick stared at it, unmoving. Then came a second message from a number he barely remembered. "You proved them wrong. I'm proud of you, little brother." D, his older brother Desmond. They hadn't spoken in years. Kendrick's hand trembled as he held the phone. He thought of his mother, of every sleepless night in the library, of every door slammed in his face. He hadn't made it to hurt anyone. He'd made it to remind people that justice doesn't require credentials, it requires courage. That night, as rain began to fall, in light whispers, Kendrick opened his laptop and typed one sentence: "No more silent corners, no more quiet injustice." It was time to go beyond the courtroom. It was time to build something that would outlast him. The next morning, Kendrick received a call from the National Legal Education Foundation. "We read about your case," the director said warmly. "We'd like to offer you a spot in our Legal Pipeline Scholarship Program for young leaders who've demonstrated extraordinary resilience and understanding of the law." Kendrick couldn't speak. Not because he didn't believe it, but because for so long, no one else had. After hanging up, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he returned to the small community library where it all began. The same librarian, now grayer, now slower, recognized him instantly. "I saw you on TV," she whispered, eyes shining. "You changed more than just a verdict, Kendrick." He smiled and quietly walked over to the dusty corner where he once spent nights copying case law by hand. There he left a note on the table: "For the next kid who thinks he doesn't belong, read everything. Learn everything, speak anyway." Outside, the autumn wind stirred the trees. Kendrick stood tall, the air crisp against his face. For the first time, his future didn't feel like a question. It felt like a mission, and he was ready. Later that week, Kendrick returned to the courthouse, this time by invitation. Judge Hartley had asked to see him privately. She stood waiting in her chambers, her black robe folded neatly over her arm, wearing a simple gray blazer. She looked different. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "not just for what you did, but for what you revealed." She handed Kendrick a file. Inside was a letter of recommendation written by her. To whom it may concern, it read, "Mr. Kendrick Miles possesses not only a rare legal mind, but the courage to confront bias and the grace to carry truth forward. I endorse him without reservation." Kendrick's throat tightened. "I never write letters like this," she added. "But the law needs voices like yours, loud, untrained, raw, and impossible to ignore." He nodded, unable to speak. As he turned to leave, she stopped him. "And Kendrick, yes, Your Honor, don't let them change you too much," he smiled. "I won't." And for the first time, she smiled too. But not everyone welcomed Kendrick's rise. Outside the courthouse that day, a man in a dark coat approached him. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. "You've stirred up a lot of noise, kid," the man said calmly. "Some people don't like that." Kendrick looked him in the eye. If they're uncomfortable with justice, that's their problem. The man slipped him a card, no name, no logo, just a number. There are places where truth costs more than it pays. Be careful. Kendrick didn't take it. I've made it this far without silence. I'm not about to start now. The man nodded once slowly, then walked away. Back in his apartment that night, Kendrick sat at his desk. He picked up the card from where it had landed on the floor. Then without a second thought, he tore it in half. People like that didn't scare him. What scared him was the idea that someone like him might give up just short of change because the system hoped he would. So he wrote instead, an op-ed, a call to reform radar evidence laws, a plea for transparency. And he signed it not with a title, but with a name they would remember. Kendrick launched Justice Path, a free online platform designed to help underserved communities understand their rights. With tutorials, legal templates, and step-by-step guides, the site was made for people who didn't know how to start, but needed help most. He wasn't waiting to be invited to change the system. He was building his own. Within 48 hours, the site went viral. Local schools asked to include it in civics classes. Public defenders reached out to collaborate. And young people, kids from neighborhoods like Kendrick's, began writing to him, calling him not just the courtroom kid, but our voice. Across the city, Judge Hartley opened her laptop and visited the site. She scrolled slowly through the articles, the templates, the welcoming words. Then she clicked on the About page. There, Kendrick had written, "I'm not a lawyer yet, but I know what injustice feels like. If you're tired of feeling small, this is for you." She closed the browser, leaned back, and whispered to herself, maybe the future doesn't need more judges like me. Maybe it needs more kids like him. And for once, she felt hope, not for the wall, but for what could come next. 3 weeks later, Kendrick was invited back to his old high school. It was the same building where he'd once been suspended for disrespecting the authority, just for asking a teacher why black students got harsher punishments. Now he stood on a stage in the gymnasium. Rows of students filled the bleachers. Some recognized him from TV. Others were just curious. Kendrick adjusted the mic, looked out at the sea of young faces, and took a breath. "When I was your age, I thought being smart didn't matter if no one listened," he said. "But the truth is, when you learn to speak, they can't ignore you forever." He shared his journey not with arrogance, but with honesty. The late nights, the rejection, the fear. "But I kept going," he finished, "because I knew silence was worse than failure." As he stepped down, a young student ran up holding a copy of the Constitution. "Will you sign it?" she asked shyly. Kendrick smiled, took the pen, and wrote, "Your voice matters. Use it like a sword." And with that, he passed something on not just ink, but power. Justice Path exploded in reach. Within months, it was being used in community centers, halfway houses, youth shelters. Kendrick hosted live streams, answering real legal questions, breaking down civil rights in plain English. He wasn't a celebrity. He was a lifeline. One night, he received a message from a high schooler in Louisiana. "They tried to expel me for defending myself. But I used your guide, and now I'm back in school." Kendrick reread the message 3 times, then sat in silence. What started as a desperate self-defense had turned into something larger, something undeniable. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the U.S. Department of Education. They wanted to partner. They wanted Kendrick to help reshape civics education for marginalized youth. He blinked, reread the letter, then whispered, "We're not on the sidelines anymore." Later that day, he called Judge Hartley. "You were right," he said. "The law does need new voices." Her voice cracked slightly through the phone. "No, Kendrick, it needs yours." But with impact came resistance. A conservative think tank published a hit piece on Kendrick, calling him an activist in disguise and accusing him of spreading anti-police sentiment. His inbox flooded, some with praise, others with threats. One evening as he left a workshop, a black SUV pulled up beside him. A man leaned out and hissed, "You've made enemies in high places, kid. Walk away while you still can." Kendrick froze, heart pounding, but only for a moment. He stepped forward, met the man's gaze, and replied, "I don't scare easy, and I don't walk away when people need me." The SUV drove off. Later that night, he called Aaron, his longtime tech partner. "They're trying to shut us down," Kendrick said. Aaron was quiet for a moment. "Then we make it too loud to ignore." They doubled their efforts, hardened the servers, uploaded every guide in triplicate, because Kendrick had learned something in that courtroom that never left him. Power doesn't fear violence. It fears truth that won't shut up. And Kendrick Miles had no intention of going quiet. Months later, Kendrick returned to River Point Courthouse, not for a hearing, but for a ceremony. He stood at the podium beside Judge Evelyn Hartley, who had since retired but remained a fierce voice for change. She spoke first. "I once believed the law should be left to the professionals," she said, glancing at Kendrick. "But this young man reminded me that justice doesn't come from who wears the robe. It comes from who dares to challenge the silence." Kendrick stepped up next, eyes scanning a room filled with students, lawyers, and community leaders. "I'm not here to ask for reform," he said. "I'm here to demand we make the law ours again, for the poor, for the voiceless, for every kid who walks into court thinking no one will believe them." The crowd rose to their feet. After the ceremony, a young boy approached him. "I want to be like you," he whispered. Kendrick knelt down and said, "No, be better than me. Start sooner, speak louder." And with that, the cycle turned. One voice had echoed. Now it was multiplying. Years passed. Kendrick Miles became a licensed attorney, a civil rights leader, and a household name in communities once forgotten. But he never forgot who he was, the boy with the second-hand shoes and a binder full of handwritten statutes. He still returned to River Point once a year, visited the courtroom, sat in the back row, and watched the next generation speak. Justice Path grew into a national movement, helping thousands avoid wrongful evictions, navigate arrests, and reclaim their dignity. But Kendrick didn't do it for applause. He did it because somewhere out there, another 19-year-old was walking into a courtroom alone. And this time, maybe they wouldn't have to. One day, as he walked through the halls of Congress to testify on police reform, he passed a group of students on a field trip. One of them gasped, "That's him." Kendrick turned, smiled, and simply said, "Speak loud, and never let anyone tell you you don't belong." And then he kept walking, calm, steady, unstoppable. Not just a man who won a case, but one who rewrote the rules, with nothing but truth fire and the belief that justice was worth fighting for. Justice isn't reserved for the wealthy or well-connected. It belongs to those brave enough to seek it and relentless enough to fight for it. Kendrick's story reminds us that real power comes not from titles, but from truth, and the courage to speak it even when no one's listening.